Fire if they resist. The HOA president's order crackled over the radio, like she was coordinating a raid instead of a neighborhood dispute. The officers' grips tightened around their weapons. For months, I had endured their game as a bogus fines, veiled threats, and notes slipped under my door at night. But today was different. I stepped outside without a word, shovel in hand, and began digging. Every deliberate strike into the earth sent a metallic ring that made the officers shift uneasily. The silence from the HOA was deafening, because if what I unearthed was revealed, their carefully kept secrets would destroy them. But maybe I should start from the beginning. 3 months earlier, I was just Marcus Cartera, a 40-year-old environmental engineer, raising my 12-year-old daughter, Lily, in what I believed was a quiet suburb. My wife, Sarah, had passed 2 years before, and this house was where our last memories lived. We'd planted a rose bush in the yard on our wedding anniversary, never imagining that spot would one day become the center of a standoff with 4 patrol cars. It all began with the water bill. With my background designing water treatment systems, I knew how much water a household should use. When my bill suddenly leapt from $85 to $340, I knew something was off. I contacted the water company, filed complaints, even had them check for leaks. Nothing. That's when Victoria Pembridge, our HOA president, entered the picture. She showed up at my door with her ever-present clipboard and measuring tape, declaring my grass 0.3 inches too long and fining me $200. Victoria was obsessed with precision and probably measured her coffee in milliliters. Community standards exist for a reason, she said, scribbling notes. Her designer glasses perched just so. Behind her, 2 board members nodded along like wind-up toys. I paid, thinking it would end there. It didn't. Over the next 2 months, Victoria cited me for everything. My mailbox was out of alignment, my garden gnome non-compliant, and even Lily's sidewalk chalk drawings were considered vandalism. Each violation came with steeper fines, but what unsettled me most were the late-night warnings. The first letter appeared under my wiper blade at 3 in the morning. Some secrets should stay buried. The second slipped under my door. Stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. The third was blunt. Final warning. That's when I realized this wasn't random harassment. Someone wanted me to stop digging into the water issue. So, I turned to public records, old utility maps, anything I could find. What I uncovered was disturbing. Our neighborhood sat on land that once belonged to a military survey site back in the 1950s. The development was handled by a company called Meridian Holdings, but the documentation was strangely thin for such a large project. Even stranger, Victoria had forced 6 other families out of their homes over the last 3 years, each case marked by fines, disputes, and suspicious circumstances. My neighbor, Dorothy Harrisa. To Everynia had seen it all. At 78, sharp as a tack, and unofficial neighborhood historian, she'd worked as a secretary for the Army Corps of Engineers years ago. She still kept files most people had long forgotten. She's running a racket, told me one evening over the fence. But it's not just about property. She's guarding something buried here a long time ago. When I pressed her, she just smiled. Secrets leave traces, Marcus. You just need to know where to look. That Sunday conversation lingered in my mind. By Wednesday, Victoria had called the police, not for noise or a real dispute, but accusing me of trespassing on community land while I stood in my own backyard. She produced a survey map claiming a 3-foot strip of my yard was common property. The dates didn't line up. The signatures looked fresh. It was clearly forged. But she had filed it with the city that very morning. The officer assigned, Sarah Johnson, seemed skeptical but bound by protocol. Until this is resolved in court, you'll need to stay off that strip of land, she said, visibly uncomfortable. Behind her, Victoria was already remeasuring my grass. That was when I knew, this wasn't about petty fines or HOA politics. Victoria was trying to keep me away from a very specific spot, the same spot where Sarah and I had planted our rose bush. After every heavy rain, the ground there dipped slightly, like something large lay hidden beneath. So, when Friday arrived, Victoria escalated. She convinced the police I was a threat, urging them to act with force if I resisted. 4 squad cars for one man with a shovel seemed absurd, but Victoria had painted me as dangerous. Officer Johnson's hand hovered over her radio, not her goony. Her unease was obvious, which I appreciated. The others were tense, eyes darting to every move I made. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lily. She was at the upstairs window, proudly holding a hand-painted sign. My dad Roxa, the letters bright in rainbow colors. Even in the madness, I couldn't help but smile. She had been my anchor ever since Sarah passed. My neighbor Jake's 6-year-old son, Tommy, had spotted the commotion and whipped out his phone. He wasn't live streaming yet, just filming, but I could tell by the way he shifted for the best angle that he was already thinking about views and followers. For a kid trying to build a social media presence, a police standoff in the suburbs was gold. Jake himself stood on his porch, arms folded, watching closely, ready to step in if things turned ugly. At least I wasn't completely alone in this. Meanwhile, Victoria was in full performance mode. Clipboard in hand, she was rattling off a laundry list of my supposed suspicious behaviors and petty infractions. Between her ramblings, she measured everything in sight: the height of my fence, the gap between my mailbox and the curb, even the width of my driveway. I like those numbers would somehow justify this circus. "Mr. Carter, your grass is still 0.3 inches over regulation," she called out, unable to resist adding another fine to the pile, even in front of armed police. But the moment I drove my shovel into the spot where Sarah and I once planted our rose bush, everything shifted. The metallic clink that rang out wasn't a rock or a pipe, it was something manufactured, something hidden. Officer Johnson's eyes flickered with recognition, while Victoria's smug expression drained into sheer panic. That sound had given me confirmation. I'd just uncovered the very thing she was desperate to keep underground. The second strike of my shovel brought more than noise. As I cleared the soil, a faint smell drifted up: aged paper and rusting steel, like a time capsule sealed away for decades. What emerged was unmistakable: a military container, stamped with the seal of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That emblem changed the atmosphere instantly. Officer Johnson stepped forward, her tone firm. "Ma'am, step back. This could be federal property." She extended her arm protectively between Victoria and the box. For the first time since I'd met her, Victoria looked unsteady. The clipboard shook in her hands, her perfect composure slipping as beads of sweat ruined her flawless image. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood with intimidation suddenly seemed small. The box itself was extraordinary: wooden, roughly the size of a large toolbox, reinforced with brass edges and sealed with red wax bearing an official government stamp dated 1951. Its preservation suggested that whoever buried it had intended for it to survive time itself. Tommy, realizing the magnitude of what he was capturing, switched his recording to live stream. His whisper was trembling with excitement as he narrated for an audience that was growing by the second. "Guys, my neighbor just found some kind of military box in his yard. This is insane." Then, from across the street, I saw Dot approaching. She moved with a determination I hadn't seen in anyone her age, holding something metallic in her withered hands. When she reached the edge of my property, she raised it for me to see: an ornate brass key, old and heavy, with engravings that mirrored the container's hardware. "Mr. Carter," she said evenly, though emotion shone in her eyes, "you'll need this. My father gave it to me before he died. He told me that one day, someone would uncover what he and his team buried here, and when that day came, I was to make sure it could be opened safely." Her words sent a chill through me. Dot hadn't just been suspicious of Victoria, she'd been connected to this secret from the start. Johnson, clearly aware this was beyond her jurisdiction, radioed for backup and instructions. The other officers had loosened their stance, now more curious than wary, though their presence reminded everyone this wasn't just some neighborhood squabble anymore. We were staring at something potentially classified. Victoria, meanwhile, was unraveling. She clutched her phone, whispering urgently into it, her eyes darting between the container and me. Though her words were too low to hear, her frantic movements spoke volumes. Tommy's live stream was exploding, comments pouring in, speculations flying, strangers demanding updates as the viewer count spiked into the thousands. Jake had stepped down from his porch, arms tense, The protective look of a neighbor who'd endured too many of Victoria's power games. I studied the container while we waited for clearance. The wood looked like oak, the brass fittings custom-made, not standard military issue. This wasn't just Sturgia, it was preservation. The wax seal was still intact, except for a hairline crack where my shovel had struck. The government stamp bore not just a date, but a serial number. Dot stood silently beside me, clutching the key like it carried her entire past. 70 years, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. I've waited 70 years for this. Her words sank into me like lead. This wasn't just about corruption or harassment, this was a decades-old secret buried in our neighborhood. Meanwhile, Victoria's frantic calls grew louder, and I caught pieces of her conversation. Containment, a broken bar, damage control. Whatever was inside this box, it was enough to send the Queen of the HOA into full-blown crisis. It was dawning on everyone if Victoria's relentless campaign against me had backfired. Her own obsession had led us straight to the thing she'd been trying to bury all along. Within minutes, more officers arrived, followed by a man in a suit who introduced himself as a federal liaison. The situation had officially grown beyond HOA squabbles and neighborhood bylaws. This was no longer about grass length or mailbox placement, something far bigger was unfolding. Officer Johnson began preparing the official record of the discovery. My hands rested on the shovel, and I couldn't help thinking of Sarah. She always said this house had history, that its walls remembered things. She just never could have guessed how deep those memories went. With the liaison's approval and Dot's brass key, we broke the wax seal. The lid creaked as it lifted, releasing a stale breath of time. Inside was something wrapped in oiled cloth, astonishingly preserved. I pulled it free, a device resembling a camera, but with unusual modifications. More striking, it still seemed intact, its film cartridge untouched since 1951. I grabbed the portable scanner I kept in my truck, a tool I normally used for documenting water treatment sites. With the liaison's nod, I connected the camera. To my astonishment, it powered on. Within minutes, images appeared on my table to photographs unseen for 70 years. The first showed men in suits standing in this very area, though back then it was just an open field littered with surveying tools and heavy equipment. The second made Victoria Blanche. In stark black and white, men and women, early HOA figuresses sat around a table signing papers, but these weren't ordinary development contracts. The letterhead was from Meridian Holdings, a company with a reputation steeped in federal investigations. And there, clear as day, were briefcases full of money being exchanged. Dot edged closer, tears glinting in her eyes. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. I wasn't just a secretary back then, Marcus. I was assigned to document the project. These are my photos? I took them. Her admission hit like a thunderclap. This quiet, elderly neighbor had been the original witness of the hidden whistleblower who had carried this weight for 70 years. More images emerged as the scanner worked. One showed the ground where my house now stood, but back then it was a massive excavation pit filled with machinery. Another revealed an underground grid of pipes stretching far beyond the neighborhood. The final photograph was the most damning. Barrels marked with faded chemical hazard symbols being lowered into the earth. Even with the wear of time, the warning signs were clear enough to send a chill through anyone looking. Victoria's composure crumbled. She clutched her phone, whispering frantically, her words sharp and urgent. I caught fragments. Containment, a broken bar, damage control, a broken bar. He found it. Her panic wasn't just about fines anymore, it was about exposure. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. They understood what this meant. Victoria wasn't just a power-drunk HOA president. She was tied into a decades-long cover-up. Officer Johnson quickly called in specialized backup, specifically requesting the Environmental Crimes Unit. This wasn't just neighborhood corruption, it was a potential environmental disaster. If those barrels still sat buried under our community, leaking into the ground, then my high water bills suddenly made perfect sense. Someone was tapping into or monitoring something underground and hiding it cost a fortune. At that moment, Jake emerged from his garage, surprising me with professional-grade gear I never knew he owned. A mechanic by trade, his skills stretched far beyond cars. He unfolded a high-tech inspection drone. Marcus, he said, eyes locked on mine, if those photos show an underground system, I can scan the surface. The drone will pick up anything unusual from above. It was a reminder that despite Victoria's intimidation, this neighborhood wasn't just hers. People here still cared about each other. Meanwhile, Tommy's livestream had exploded. Thousands were now tuned in, firing off comments and theories. Some shared stories about their own shady HOAs, while others pieced together connections to past environmental scandals. A hashtag or #Pipegate had already begun trending. The most powerful moment came when Dot lifted one of the photos toward a light. Her trembling finger pointed at a man in a sharp suit. "This one," she said bitterly, "threatened my father when he tried to report them. And this woman, she was the HOA president before Victoria." The corruption didn't start with her. She inherited it. This whole system was built to protect the secret from day one. And in that moment, the full scale of the conspiracy settled over us like a heavy shadow. I couldn't stop thinking about the families who'd been pushed out over the years. How many had been forced to sell for pennies on the dollar after becoming suspicious? How many had endured the same late-night threats and harassment campaigns, only to give up before uncovering what really lay beneath these streets? Victoria's campaign hadn't been random, it was deliberate. She had targeted anyone who might stumble too close to the truth. The federal liaison was meticulous, snapping photos of the recovered photographs and cataloging everything to preserve the chain of evidence. But even he couldn't mask his unease. What had started as a petty HOA dispute was quickly unraveling into a federal case involving environmental crimes and a decade-spanning conspiracy. When the container was lifted free, the ground shifted unnaturally. Beneath the soil, my shovel struck something harder than dirt. A thin slab of concrete poured long ago, breaking through revealed a pipe, thick and metallic, running horizontally beneath my yard like a hidden artery. The technical crew Officer Johnson had called in brought ground-penetrating radar. Within minutes, the scans confirmed what the old photographs hinted at. This wasn't a lone pipe, but an entire underground system sprawling far beyond my property. The main line stretched east, toward Miller's Lake, with branches running under multiple homes in the neighborhood. And it wasn't abandoned relics we were dealing with. The system was active, maintained, used. Jake's drone launched skyward, its high-resolution feed broadcasting a bird's-eye view of the area. From above, subtle differences became obvious: shifts in grass color, faint depressions in yards outlining the hidden network below. "Marcus, look at this," Jake called, handing me the tablet. "The line doesn't stop at your property. It runs under the Henderson place, the Murphy Load, a broken bar every single home Victoria forced people out of." She wasn't being arbitrary, she was securing control of the network's access points. The evidence was undeniable. Every eviction, every violation, had been part of a calculated strategy. Officer Johnson immediately escalated the call, looping in the Environmental Protection Agency. When they arrived, their urgency was unmistakable. Specialized teams began testing the exposed system. The first results came back quickly: traces of industrial solvents and heavy metals, substances no one wanted near drinking water. Tommy's livestream had shifted from neighborhood drama to breaking national news. His viewer count skyrocketed as the story spread across platforms. Hashtags multiplying, a #Pipegate climbing fast beyond local chatter. What began as a boy filming for clout had turned into a viral expose. Copyright. The EPA's investigation led them straight to the source. Using coordinates from Jake's aerial mapping, they determined the pipeline originated at Miller's Lake, a protected watershed untouched for more than 3 decades. Someone had illegally tapped into it, siphoning water into a covert network hidden beneath our homes. The implications were staggering. Not only had environmental laws been shattered, but thousands of residents, possibly more, had been unknowingly exposed. Then came the arrival of Councilman Bradley Thornton, trailed by lawyers. On paper, he claimed to be protecting the community. But the nervous sweat, the sharp whispers, the timing, it was obvious he was here to protect himself. Thornton had been Victoria's staunchest ally for years, pushing her policies and signing off on zoning adjustments that conveniently aligned with the property she seized. Now, his presence confirmed it. This conspiracy ran deeper than one power-hungry HOA president. It reached into City Hall. As the EPA mapped the network, my mind kept drifting back to the displaced families. The Hendersons supposedly moving for lifestyle changes. The Murphys downsizing after Victoria buried them in fines. The Chings chased out after endless harassment. None of them had left by choice. They'd been forced out, erased, all to protect the secret beneath our lawns. EPA specialists pulled samples from multiple access points. The readings were green, contamination levels far exceeding safe drinking standards. This wasn't just an environmental violation. It was a public health disaster concealed for generations. And suddenly, my absurdly high water bills made sense. The charges weren't random, they were the cost of sustaining and disguising this underground operation. Victoria, realizing her empire was collapsing, lost the last shred of her composure. She wasn't making polite calls anymore. She was practically shrieking into her phone, pacing like a trapped animal. I caught fragments. Extraction procedures, a broken bar containment, a broken bar, emergency protocols. She knew the game was up. The fragments of Victoria's frantic calls made it clear she was invoking emergency protocols and extraction procedures. Whatever this network was meant to support, the operation was already shifting into shutdown mode. The real question wasn't whether they would try to erase evidence, but if they could succeed before federal investigators documented the full scope of their crimes. Jake's drone became our eyes in the sky, feeding back real-time intelligence that painted a chilling picture. Trucks rolled up to several of the implicated properties, loading equipment under the guise of ordinary neighborhood activity. It wasn't just a cover-up anymore, it was the collapse of the entire operation unfolding in plain sight. Officer Johnson tightened coordination with federal teams, expanding the perimeter while the EPA continued their hazardous materials assessment. What had begun as a simple clash over water bills had escalated into the exposure of a sprawling, decades-long scheme, a conspiracy of environmental destruction, political corruption, and systematic intimidation of homeowners who had unknowingly stumbled too close to the truth. The terrifying part was realizing how narrowly Victoria had almost succeeded. If I hadn't pushed back against those rising utility charges, a broken bar, if hadn't safeguarded evidence for 70 years, a broken bar, if we hadn't dared to dig in my own backyard, this could have continued unchecked for another generation. And if it had happened here, how many other communities might be enduring the same hidden web of corruption masquerading as HOA politics? The unraveling took a decisive turn through sheer accident. While adjusting her gear, Officer Johnson mistakenly switched Victoria's borrowed police radio to the wrong frequency. Suddenly, every word of Victoria's increasingly desperate phone calls was being blasted through the patrol car's loudspeaker for the entire neighborhood to hear. If they find the main extraction point, we're finished. Her voice crackled over the speakers, sharp and undeniable. Get the emergency teams and now strip the secondary sites before morning. Nothing can lead back to the primary system. The stunned silence of neighbors, agents, and reporters gave way to a storm of whispers. Then Tommy's live stream exploded with chatter, his viewers realizing they were witnessing a live confession to a massive criminal conspiracy. She just admitted everything on open radio, he shouted, his excitement radiating through the broadcast as comments flooded faster than he could track. Meanwhile, the EPA's instruments revealed a grimmer truth. This wasn't just contaminated groundwater. Industrial solvents and toxic waste were actively being pumped through the underground grid beneath our home yards where children played, wells families drank from. The contamination levels they were logging weren't borderline, they demanded immediate evacuation and full-scale remediation. Before we could even process it, the ground beneath us began to hum. Not construction, not traffic. The EPA's monitors confirmed, high-capacity pumps had been activated. The emergency extraction Victoria had ordered was already underway. Jake's drone captured the moment the true horror became visible. Miller's Lake, the supposed pristine watershed, began draining before our eyes. In under half an hour, its level dropped several feet, exposing scars of drilling and concrete structures that had been hidden beneath the surface for decades. What had once looked like an untouched ecosystem was revealed as an industrial crime scene. Neighbors, once silent out of fear, began breaking ranks. Eleanor Fitzgerald, one of Victoria's staunchest defenders, shouted across the street, her voice shaking with betrayal. You told us this was about property values. You've been poisoning us. How many people got sick while you smiled in our faces? Her courage sparked a flood of voices. Families stepped forward with stories, children's unexplained illnesses, pets dying after drinking backyard water, tap water so foul-tasting they'd resorted to bottled supplies. A grim mosaic of health issues formed, one that nobody had dared piece together until now. Councilman Thornton's lawyers tried in vain to control the narrative. But the evidence kept building. Jake's drone footage revealed trucks carting off equipment from the lake and shipping out massive containers. Every move documented and broadcast live as the cover-up crumbled in real time. When Victoria finally realized her own radio had been betraying her, she snapped. Tossing her clipboard to the ground, she bolted toward her car. But by then, neighbors, media, and agents had effectively sealed every exit. For once, her aura of authority was gone, replaced by wild panic. "This grass is still over regulation length," she screamed at me in a bizarre attempt to cling to her old tactics, even as her empire collapsed. By then, the response had surged far beyond anything local authorities could manage. EPA reinforcements poured in from multiple states, the FBI had formally launched an investigation, and the Department of Justice was already reviewing charges under federal environmental protection laws. What had started as a suburban feud was now a full-blown, multi-agency federal case with national implications. And through it all, Tommy's live stream remained the pulse of the story. His coverage wasn't just entertainment anymore, it had become the nation's window into the unraveling of a decades-old conspiracy. The #Pipegate quickly gained national traction, with people across the country posting about questionable HOA behavior and strange environmental problems in their own towns. What started as a local crisis was sparking a much larger dialogue about environmental justice and corporate responsibility. The most powerful moment of the evening came when Dot finally shared the truth she'd carried in silence for 70 years. "My father tried to expose this in 1951, she told the gathered crowd, her voice trembling with emotion. "They threatened to strip his military pension and ruin our family if he went public. I've waited my entire adult life for someone with the courage to uncover the truth. Today, we finally have a chance at justice." Her words carried the weight of generations, and I saw tears in the eyes of neighbors as they realized how long this hidden crime had haunted their community. As Victoria's stranglehold over the neighborhood crumbled, I couldn't help but reflect on the countless small choices that had brought us here. My stubborn curiosity about those strange water bills, Dot preserving her father's files for decades, Jake lending his technical expertise, Tommy streaming everything despite the risks, and Officer Johnson's commitment to doing her job the right way. It had taken a whole community, united in small acts of courage, to defeat a machine that had seemed untouchable. I retrieved the most advanced tool I own, my laser mapping device, normally used for environmental surveys. It wasn't some futuristic invention, just standard equipment for documenting contaminated sites. Its strength came from integrating decades of existing data. I explained to the federal team that by connecting it to the underground system, we could overlay city records, utility maps, and geological surveys. Within minutes, Jake had set up a portable generator from his garage, powering a large display screen in my front yard. The device began stitching together a three-dimensional map, layering years of survey data into a living model. The result was staggering. The pipe system wasn't confined to a few homes. It spanned 12 properties, all tied to families that Victoria had driven out. Even more shocking, the system connected to underground storage tanks listed in city records as private storage. These were, in reality, chemical waste facilities buried beneath residential homes, many of them still active and updated as recently as the year before. As the map flickered across the screen, Dot stepped forward once again, this time clutching a manila envelope she had hidden for decades. "Marcus," she said, her hand shaking, "there's one more thing." Inside were copies of every document her father had saved, contracts, construction records, and lists of the people involved. Some of the signatures matched current city officials and local business leaders who were still part of the conspiracy. The crowd pressed closer as Tommy's live stream surged past 100,000 live viewers. The comments section turned into a flood of people nationwide sharing similar experiences, suddenly connecting dots about corruption and pollution in their own neighborhoods. Then the cavalry arrived, 15 federal vehicles pulling into the street, The FBI and EPA had officially taken control, with teams specializing in organized crime, corruption, and environmental violations. Agent Martinez from the FBI's Environmental Crime Task Force took charge, coordinating with EPA experts to secure every shred of evidence. The arrests came fast. Councilman Thornton was led away in handcuffs beside his city-issued SUV, facing charges of conspiracy, corruption, and knowingly endangering public health. His fall from power was streamed live to thousands, an unfiltered end to his career. Victoria's capture was even more surreal. As agents approached with cuffs, she clutched her measuring tape, still shouting about lawn heights and rule violations even as she was taken into custody. Tommy's chat exploded with disbelief as viewers couldn't believe they were watching an HOA president try to enforce regulations while being arrested for federal crimes. Within hours, federal agents dissolved the HOA entirely, declaring it a front for organized criminal activity. An emergency neighborhood meeting followed. Unlike anything we'd ever seen, residents who had lived in fear of Victoria's harassment were finally free to speak. Eleanor Fitzgerald was unanimously chosen as interim president of a new resident council, designed to operate on transparency and democracy rather than intimidation. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Town neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly working side by side, organizing cleanup efforts and supporting families hurt by the contamination. EPA testing confirmed what many had feared. Contamination levels were so severe that some families needed to be relocated immediately. The cleanup costs would run into the millions, paid for through asset seizures from the conspiracy. Jake's drone footage became vital evidence, documenting the emergency extraction at Miller's Lake and the scale of the damage hidden beneath the water. Tommy, who had started the day chasing social media clout, had become an accidental journalist. His live stream was being cited by major outlets, and his footage would become a cornerstone in prosecuting one of the largest environmental crime cases in recent history. As the chaos began to ease, Lily came running into my arms. "Dad, you saved our whole town," she whispered, hugging me tightly. At that moment, I realized this had started with nothing more than a question about a water bill, yet it had ended with uncovering decades of corruption and environmental destruction. What began with a rose bush that Sarah and I had planted had turned into the key that unearthed the truth and brought long overdue justice to our community. As the sun dipped low, I looked around at a scene I'd never imagined: it, neighbors helping one another, federal agents carefully preserving evidence, and a neighborhood finally free from the fear that had haunted us for years. Victoria's grip on us was gone, but more importantly, the crimes poisoning our land and water for 70 years were finally being confronted. Dot's patience and courage in holding on to the truth all those decades had finally paid off. Justice was no longer a dream, it was happening. I knew the road ahead would be long. The cleanup would take years, the court cases even longer, and the full scope of the conspiracy was still unraveling. But for the first time since moving here, I felt like we belonged to a real community, a one built on trust, honesty, and neighbors standing together rather than hiding in fear. Later, Jason Miller in Chicago closed his coverage with a challenge to viewers: if you uncovered something suspicious where you lived, would you dig for the truth like Marcus had, or would you turn away? He asked people to share how far they'd go to protect their own community. The story was clearly far from over. Just 2 weeks after the arrests, our neighborhood felt transformed, as if a long occupation had finally ended. Victoria and Councilman Thornton now faced 15 federal charges each, from racketeering and conspiracy to corruption and environmental crimes. Investigators traced their financial web across 3 states, uncovering millions in profits from the illegal extraction network that had poisoned families for generations. Thanks to the meticulous records Dodd's father had saved and Tommy's real-time coverage, the cleanup was progressing faster than anyone thought possible. The EPA had made our case a top priority, bringing in specialized crews who worked day and night to restore the groundwater and neutralize toxic sites. Even more meaningful, the methods developed here were already being applied to other communities across the nation where residents were raising similar alarms about corrupt HOAs and unexplained environmental issues. For me, the discovery opened a new path. The EPA offered me a position as Chief Environmental Monitor for the region, where I could help other communities uncover hidden crimes just like ours. It felt like the right way to honor Sarah's memory, and Lily proudly told people her dad was now a professional truth digger. I couldn't think of a better title. Tommy, who once just wanted to boost his social media channel, was suddenly recognized as a citizen journalist. His live stream hit more than 2 million views, and his hashtag sparked congressional hearings on HOA oversight and environmental justice. Universities even offered him scholarships for his work, recognizing the impact of his documentation on exposing one of the largest environmental crime networks in recent history. Eleanor's newly formed resident council was the complete opposite of Victoria's iron-fisted HOA. Meetings were open, decisions democratic, and the focus shifted to building trust and supporting one another. The change was so profound that, even amid ongoing remediation, property values rose as families were drawn to the sense of genuine community. Jake, meanwhile, received recognition from the EPA for his technical expertise, and his drone footage was being used in training for environmental investigators. Even more importantly, his work uncovered 12 other communities suffering from similar underground networks alleged that were already resulting in more arrests and cleanup operations in several states. And Dota, once a quiet keeper of secrets, had become a local hero. Historical societies honored her father's courage, and she was now invited to speak at environmental justice conferences, urging others never to discard evidence no matter how long it takes for the truth to matter. At 78, she was busier than she'd been in decades, traveling to inspire other communities to dig deeper. The most significant outcome was the creation of a federal task force dedicated to exposing environmental crimes linked to HOA corruption. Our case proved this wasn't isolated but part of a much bigger pattern across the country. Within months, investigations were underway in 15 states using the very methods and tools developed during our ordeal. The financial penalties were enough not only to fund full remediation but also to compensate families displaced or harmed by contamination. Assets from Victoria and her co-conspirators were liquidated to cover costs, turning their ill-gotten wealth into restitution. Justice was no longer abstract, it was visible in safer homes, cleaner water, and restored lives. As I stood in my backyard, I gazed at the spot where Sarah and I had once planted a simple rose bush. That small act of love had become the thread that unraveled a vast conspiracy. Today, a new rose bush thrived there, planted with Lily's help, its roots in soil that was finally clean. It was more than just a flower, it was a symbol of renewal, proof that when truth surfaces, healing begins. Our once quiet street was no longer filled with whispers of fear but with laughter, chatter over fences, and the sound of children playing freely. The dark rain that had smothered us for years had ended, not with violence, but with neighbors standing together for truth and justice. Yet just as I was enjoying the peace one Saturday morning, watering that very rose bush, a sleek black SUV pulled to the curb. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his stride confident, his gaze locked on me. He walked straight over as if he already owned the place. As the chaos began to ease, Lily came running into my arms. "Dad, you saved our whole town," she whispered, hugging me tightly. At that moment, I realized this had started with nothing more than a question about a water bill, yet it had ended with uncovering decades of corruption and environmental destruction. What began with a rose bush that Sarah and I had planted had turned into the key that unearthed the truth and brought long overdue justice to our community. As the sun dipped low, I looked around at a scene I'd never imagined it: neighbors helping one another, federal agents carefully preserving evidence, and a neighborhood finally free from the fear that had haunted us for years. Victoria's grip on us was gone, but more importantly, the crimes poisoning our land and water for 70 years were finally being confronted. Dot's patience and courage in holding on to the truth all those decades had finally paid off. Justice was no longer a dream, it was happening. I knew the road ahead would be long, the cleanup would take years, the court cases even longer, and the full scope of the conspiracy was still unraveling. But for the first time since moving here, I felt like we belonged to a real community, a one built on trust, honesty, and neighbors standing together rather than hiding in fear. Later, Jason Miller in Chicago closed his coverage with a challenge to viewers: if you uncovered something suspicious where you lived, would you dig for the truth like Marcus had? Or would you turn away? He asked people to share how far they'd go to protect their own community. The story was clearly far from over. Just 2 weeks after the arrests, our neighborhood felt transformed as if a long occupation had finally ended. Victoria and Councilman Thornton now faced 15 federal charges each, from racketeering and conspiracy to corruption and environmental crimes. Investigators traced their financial web across 3 states, uncovering millions in profits from the illegal extraction network that had poisoned families for generations. Thanks to the meticulous records Dodd's father had saved and Tommy's real-time coverage, the cleanup was progressing faster than anyone thought possible. The EPA had made our case a top priority, bringing in specialized crews who worked day and night to restore the groundwater and neutralize toxic sites. Even more meaningful, the methods developed here were already being applied to other communities across the nation where residents were raising similar alarms about corrupt HOAs and unexplained environmental issues. For me, the discovery opened a new path. The EPA offered me a position as Chief Environmental Monitor for the region, where I could help other communities uncover hidden crimes just like ours. It felt like the right way to honor Sarah's memory, and Lily proudly told people her dad was now a professional truth digger. I couldn't think of a better title. Tommy, who once just wanted to boost his social media channel, was suddenly recognized as a citizen journalist. His live stream hit more than 2 million views, and his hashtag sparked congressional hearings on HOA oversight and environmental justice. Universities even offered him scholarships for his work, recognizing the impact of his documentation on exposing one of the largest environmental crime networks in recent history. Eleanor's newly formed resident council was the complete opposite of Victoria's iron-fisted HOA. Meetings were open, decisions democratic, and the focus shifted to building trust and supporting one another. The change was so profound that, even amid ongoing remediation, property values rose as families were drawn to the sense of genuine community. Jake, meanwhile, received recognition from the EPA for his technical expertise, and his drone footage was being used in training for environmental investigators. Even more importantly, his work uncovered 12 other communities suffering from similar underground networks alleged that were already resulting in more arrests and cleanup operations in several states. And Doda, once a quiet keeper of secrets, had become a local hero. Historical societies honored her father's courage, and she was now invited to speak at environmental justice conferences, urging others never to discard evidence no matter how long it takes for the truth to matter. At 78, she was busier than she'd been in decades, traveling to inspire other communities to dig deeper. The most significant outcome was the creation of a federal task force dedicated to exposing environmental crimes linked to HOA corruption. Our case proved this wasn't isolated but part of a much bigger pattern across the country. Within months, investigations were underway in 15 states using the very methods and tools developed during our ordeal. The financial penalties were enough not only to fund full remediation but also to compensate families displaced or harmed by contamination. Assets from Victoria and her co-conspirators were liquidated to cover costs, turning their ill-gotten wealth into restitution. Justice was no longer abstract, it was visible in safer homes, cleaner water, and restored lives. As I stood in my backyard, I gazed at the spot where Sarah and I had once planted a simple rose bush. That small act of love had become the thread that unraveled a vast conspiracy. Today, a new rose bush thrived there, planted with Lily's help, its roots in soil that was finally clean. It was more than just a flower, it was a symbol of renewal, proof that when truth surfaces, healing begins. Our once quiet street was no longer filled with whispers of fear but with laughter, chatter over fences, and the sound of children playing freely. The dark rain that had smothered us for years had ended, not with violence, but with neighbors standing together for truth and justice. Yet just as I was enjoying the peace one Saturday morning, watering that very rose bush, a sleek black SUV pulled to the curb. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his stride confident, his gaze locked on me. He walked straight over as if he already owned the place.